This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. Today, I am joined by Dr. Nikki Clark to talk about her new book, The Waiting Game, The Untold Story of the Women Who Served the Tudor Court. Nikki, welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And I should correct the title already. I already messed it up. The Tudor Queens, the women who served the Tudor Queens. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
The last time you were on the show, we talked about the Howard women and one of my favorite Howards, Mary Howard. And I think that book was the one that inspired this one, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So when I was writing about the Howard women, I wrote a chapter about them as courtiers at court. And while I was doing that, I realized that the context that I wanted to be able to put them in just didn't really exist in the way that I needed it to. So I thought, well, all right, there's the next project. And that gradually became this book. While I was researching, I was thinking, I bet more people than a few academics would be interested in reading this. So I wrote it for a broader audience in a kind of narrative history style.
Yeah, it's written so well, and I highly recommend you go out and get it. I looked, is it not available in the US yet?
It is not available in the US yet, but it's going to be, hopefully, about January 2025. We don't have a precise date yet, but I do have a US publisher, and it is kind of in progress, so it will come into the US.
Wonderful. Well, put it on your wish list or order it from the UK. I just go out and get this book because it's going to really open your eyes to the women who served these queens. And I think to start off the book, I was really surprised at how much there was about Maria de Salinas, who, of course, I think everybody knows who she was. But in case they don't, why don't you give us a little bit of background on her?
Sure. So Maria de Salinas was one of Catherine of Aragon's Spanish ladies in waiting. And we know a surprising amount about her and yet also nothing about her. So she does have an Oxford Dictionary of National Biography article. She does appear in various English sources. There's this glorious, like, continuing slight urban legend that Catherine of Aragon died in Maria's arms in January 1536. So, you know, we know her, and we know her as this uber loyal woman to Catherine of Aragon. But in the course of my research, I came across some more sources about Maria that really highlight a lot more about her, and she's not as straightforward as that kind of loyal lady in waiting. Now, I hesitate to say that I found more sources because they weren't lost. I think it's common among historians to say, oh, I found this. No. It was filed in an archive exactly where it was meant to be. We just didn't know it was there. But yeah, I was poking around trying to find out who her parents were, because that was one of the things that we didn't really seem to know. Different secondary sources will give you her parentage differently, and none of them can back that up or really kind of make that mean anything, like link it to the Spanish nobility or anything like that. And I thought, well, all right, can I do any better? So I fell down a lot of Google rabbit holes, and I came across some more recent research into some people who turned out to be related to Maria. And I found out that there were letters that she wrote back home to her family from England in the archive in Simancas among her brother-in-law's papers, because he was a treasurer to the Spanish crown. That was really cool.
I found most interesting when you talked about a marriage arrangement that was trying to be connected in Spain with her. And that was something that I had never known about. And of course, I don't want to give up too much of your book, but could you maybe touch on that a little bit? Because all I had ever known was her marriage in England. I didn't know that there was a possible marriage that could have happened in Spain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Maria's family are courtiers. They're not noble. They don't have a title, but they are kind of service courtiers, as you would find in the English court. They've worked their way up, and nearly all her family are in service with the Spanish crown in one way or another. Often as financiers or treasurers or things like that. They're kind of from merchant roots. And her sisters are in service with Catherine of Aragon's sisters, and it's all very, incestuous in that way. But yeah, so Maria came to England with Catherine in 1501. She served her while she married Prince Arthur. She was there when Catherine was widowed. And then she, like Catherine of Aragon and the rest of her Spanish household, got stuck in this awful limbo period during her widowhood after Arthur dies and before she marries the future Henry VIII, where Catherine of Aragon is this pawn between her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, who hasn't finished paying her dowry, and her father-in-law, King Henry VII, who says, well, until you do finish paying her dowry, we can't do nothing. And so she becomes this financial pawn, and her household are, I use the word poverty loosely because for most normal people, they were not in poverty. But for a princess, absolutely in poverty. And the narrative that you kind of assume is that her women are there loyal with her, stuck in this. But actually, they are stuck in it, and they're desperate to get out. And the only way that her Spanish women can leave her service is to get married. And for most of them, that means that their families need to arrange a marriage for them back home. And that's what Maria's family are trying to do. Not very well. They're not very good at it. Her older brother is the one who's the kind of head of the family at this point. And either he's just not trying very hard, or he's just really bad at kind of worldly things, because there's at least one match just falls through. And Maria, in her letters, is continually like, tell me more. What is happening? Why is this not progressing? I can't speak to the Queen until you tell me that something is arranged. Like, what is going on? Have you spoken to this person? She feels very cut off.
Yeah, I get the impression, I guess the stuff that I have learned about Catherine of Aragon's life in Spain and how well educated she was, I get the impression that Maria was just as well educated, and she kind of reminds me of Mary Howard in a bit as well.
Yeah, I think Maria must have been pretty well educated. We know that Queen Isabella of Castile had a woman in her court called Beatriz Galindo La Latina, because she spoke Latin. And yes, the princesses were taught Latin. They were also taught French. It's quite likely that Maria was pretty well educated and probably spoke French, although not English. But yes, she is not backwards in coming forwards like a lot of, I want to say successful female courtiers at this time. I don't know if there's really such a thing as a successful female courtier, because so much relies on circumstances around them that they couldn't control. But yes, she knows what she wants and what she needs, and she speaks her mind.
I love that. It's something that maybe you don't see enough in the 16th century, or even in the non-modern day, the women who would speak their mind. And I liked how you touched a little bit on maybe the conflict that she had, considering the idea of marrying an Englishman and not being able to return to Spain. Can you maybe touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, Maria was definitely desperate to go home in the very early 1500s. I mean, she'd been on the Welsh borders with Catherine of Aragon, and that must have been probably not the most fun winter she'd ever spent. I mean, there are parts of Spain that are cold. Northern Spain gets cold in winter. She's used to traveling. There are records that show that, she'd been south in Granada and up in Castile and all over the place. But she does say in one of her letters that this is not a country to stop in unless necessary. So she does not want to stay in England. So the fact that she did, we don't really know precisely why that is. It may just be that all the Spanish marriages fell through. We don't have kind of all the letters she ever sent. There's a set of about 20, but that's not a huge number, really, considering how many a woman probably would have written over the course of a year.
Yeah.
And we just don't know why she ended up staying in England, whether that was her family saying, no, you're more used to us here, or whether it was simply that the opportunity to get out just didn't materialize. In the end, she married William, who was Baron Willoughby in England, which arguably is a higher status marriage than she could have got in Spain. So in some ways, she did better, you know, from a purely kind of economic or status point of view by staying in England.
Yeah. And she stayed by Catherine of Aragon's side basically until the bitter end, which who doesn't love a story of friendship like that? She clearly was very close with Catherine. And of course, we want to imagine she was there holding her at the very end, but she was there. And I love
She was there.
I love
Yeah.
that part of the story. And I'm sure we've covered it on the show before, but can you talk about her trip to Kimbolton and how that all played out and what might be true and what might not be true?
Yeah. So Maria was dismissed or sent away from Catherine's service, like many women were in the sort of early 1530s. Maria's daughter, Catherine Willoughby, is married to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, in, I think it's 1533. And so actually she's in London with Catherine a lot of the time. Charles Brandon is one of the people that Henry VIII quite often sends to do his dirty work for him. So Charles Brandon, at least a couple of times, is sent to Catherine of Aragon to kind of, you know, tell her to stop protesting and do as she's told, basically, and gets yelled at. And I think Maria hears this from him. So she knew when Catherine of Aragon was ill. She knew that at one point Catherine was meant to be dying and then she rallied, etc. But she knew that things were not good. So at the very end of 1535, she wrote to Thomas Cromwell to say, can I visit her? And it's a really clever letter because she manages to sidestep having to give Catherine any title. So she doesn't have to use the hated Princess Dowager title. She just kind of doesn't really call her anything. And she says, you promised I could go. We don't know whether Cromwell replied to her because if he did, we don't have the reply surviving. But to be honest, regardless, she didn't wait long enough for there to be a reply. She just left. So it's like she wrote the letter so she could later go, look, see, I asked. And then she just got on a horse and rode north out of London. And before she got there, she either did fall off her horse into the mud and the cold, or she pretended that she had, because she turned up soaked, covered in mud. And the guards are like, well, show us your letters. Like, we need to know you have a right to be here. And she's like, I'll give you whatever you want, but you're going to need to let me get to the fire first, because unless you want me to die of cold out here. So she talks her way in. They let her in. She sort of vanishes into the Queen's chambers and just never comes back out. So they never get a letter saying she's supposed to be here. They write to Cromwell later like, were we supposed to, like, what? So yeah, she is there when Catherine of Aragon gets worse, and she's there when Catherine dies. So you never know. Catherine might have died in her arms, but we can't prove that bit.
Right. I loved how you told that part of the story in the book too. Like maybe she threw herself into the mud. We just don't know.
It worked.
It did. And then she was there, I think you said for the whole month of January, she was there, and she was there when these, I don't even know how to describe it, untrained people took care of Catherine's body.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly who it is, but it's a couple of household servants you would not expect to be involved in the embalming process. You know, open her up,
I think one of them you said was like a candle maker.
Yeah, I mean, we know who they were because it's in the sources. Yeah, it's a bit bizarre. So far as we can tell, Maria was definitely there because she's there for the funeral, which is about a month after the death. And she's one of the mourners. So before the actual funeral takes place, there are various funeral masses in the days preceding it. And they need kind of official mourners for each one, and each one, a different woman kind of takes the lead. And Maria is one of those. And it takes them ages to get the official black clothing. And yeah, there's all sorts of things that just don't work as smoothly as they would have done had Catherine been a queen in favor.
Do you think some of that had to do with the fact that Henry was, just so anxious to move on with his life with Anne as well, to kind of close that chapter?
It's that, but I think it's more that no one quite knows how a princess dowager ought to be treated. Like, where should she be buried? What does what kind of what the Spanish ambassador and the Spanish crown think she ought to have is not what Henry wants to give her. So he doesn't want to give her a massive funeral, in St. Paul's or in Westminster and allow the whole populace to grieve and like say how much they loved her. Like, no, we've moved on. But again, he doesn't want to offend the Spanish monarchs by, throwing her in a ditch somewhere. So Peterborough Abbey is a kind of uneasy compromise.
It's so crazy to me. We talk about these ladies in waiting and Catherine of Aragon's ladies, how many of the Spanish ones stayed and how many left. But the ones who stayed primarily married Englishmen, did they not?
They did, yeah. There aren't that many who stay, or there aren't that many whose names we definitely have. So really, the ones that we know of who stay are Maria and Inez de Vanegas. She marries William Lord Mountjoy, but she doesn't live particularly long into Henry VIII's reign, which is why I didn't kind of use her as a major character to follow, just because she wasn't there long enough for there to be much source material. Other Spanish names do sometimes pop up in the records, but it's very difficult to know who they are, and they tend to be of a slightly lower status. And there may have been some wives of Spanish male members of the household, but they weren't technically ladies in waiting. So again, they don't pop up in the records much.
And he was married to Catherine of Aragon so long. And if I recall, he was married to her longer than his other 5 wives combined.
Pretty much, yeah.
Which is ridiculous. Yeah. And there were women from her household that then moved to Anne Boleyn's household and then continued that way and that way. And you did touch base on some of these women who carried over. Of those women, which ones stand out the most to you?
I mean, Jane, Lady Rochford. She served 5 of 6 wives, so I felt like I couldn't not use her, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And she's one of the women that, again, a lot of people have already heard of. Now, I have yet to find, this is not to say I might not, but I've yet to find a woman who served all 6 wives. If you look on the internet, you can see kind of this woman did or this woman did, but when you actually drill down and try and find a contemporary source that makes that clear, that it kind of vanishes into the ether. So some people say that Anne Parr served all 6 wives. I cannot find evidence to say that that's the case. She may have done, but the most that I've found for sure is 5 out of 6 wives. And Jane Rochford is one of those who, transferred to Anne Boleyn because she was Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, so that makes sense. And after that, I think partly because she kind of helps the trial out. I don't think she meant to. She got judged very heavily at the time and ever since for providing evidence that helped them to convict her husband, George Boleyn. But I think what most likely had happened is that she'd gone to try to see the king to sue on George's behalf, as a good wife should do, but the king wasn't seeing anyone, so she saw Cromwell and probably just didn't last very long under his questioning. I think once Cromwell's got you, he's not the king's chief minister for nothing. I don't know how well any of us would have stood up under interrogation by, chief ministers. And I think she probably gave him a lot of information under Lord knows what kind of threats or promises. But possibly because of that, Cromwell sees her safely into Jane Seymour's household. And after that time, by that point, she's quite experienced. And most queens want some experience to help guide them in their new role. And that's really important for many of Henry's queens, just because a lot of them weren't born to be queen. You know, Catherine of Aragon knew how to be a queen because she'd watched her mum do it.
Yeah.
But actually, most of Henry's wives hadn't. And they stepped into this role that was kind of way too big for them. And they need help to know what they're doing. And ladies in waiting are part of that.
Yeah, so that leads me to the big question that I know everybody always wants to know about, and I'm hoping you can enlighten us a little bit on the different roles in the Queen's household and what each title meant and what their responsibilities were. And I know that's a big question, but do your best for the listeners.
The only reason it's an awkward question is because the different kind of positions are not always given the same names in documents at the same time, which is really annoying. In the same way as rooms in palaces are not always described the same way. So is it a watching chamber, a guard chamber, or what is it? Well, it depends who's writing the list. And it's a little bit similar with some positions at court. So early on, when Catherine of Aragon becomes queen, the system is still, I suppose, the basic medieval system. There's three major ranks. So you've got the ladies, who tend to be, not very many of them, maybe four, of kind of the highest status, maybe the queen's relatives, or, you know, a duchess or something like that. Then you've got the gentlewomen, or sometimes they're called the ladies and gentlewomen, and they tend to be maybe the daughters of noblemen or knights' wives or things like that. And there are more of them. There might be, I don't know, 12 to 15 perhaps. And then at the bottom you'd have chamberers, and again, fewer of those, between 2 and 4, and they are still really of kind of middling gentry, lower noble status, but lower than the rest, and they tend to do the slightly more menial tasks. So they do things like look after the queen's chambers, or take custody of her jewels and things like that. As Henry's reign progresses, there's some evidence to suggest that those three ranks kind of diversify a bit. And that's partly because the whole royal household is undergoing a lot of reform through Henry's reign. This is where we see the Privy Chamber really become increasingly regulated. And because of that, there's a list from around Catherine Howard's time in about 1540 that shows, again, the great ladies. They've become great ladies now. They're the kind of really posh ones at the top. And then you've got ladies and gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber, but also a separate ladies and gentlewomen attendant, who are just kind of out there in the presence chamber, not allowed in, but still in service, and the chamberers. And at some point, probably during Catherine of Aragon's tenure, you also get the maids of honour. And that's a term that is really useful to authors, and it's used all over the place. If you don't know what position a woman at court held, she'll probably be called a maid of honour by a historian. But actually, there were only ever 6 at a time, and a mother of the maids. And they are adolescent girls, usually about 16, for whom the court is a kind of finishing school environment. So they're there to polish their social skills and their accomplishments and find a husband, probably. And the mother of the maids is there to make sure they behave themselves with varying success. So yeah, that's the kind of basic structure of what's going on.
Yeah. And so when you talk about Jane Seymour, because it's believed that she joined Catherine of Aragon's household, what role do you think Jane Seymour started out as?
This is another tricky one. So the reason we think Jane Seymour was in Catherine of Aragon's household is because Charles Wriothesley says so later on in his chronicle, but he doesn't say what position she was in, and he is the only source for it. I couldn't find anything that was slightly closer contemporary, because Wriothesley is writing later in the 1550s. He's probably Risley rather than Wriothesley, isn't he? But I just see the name and Writhe. Yeah. If she was there, it really depends how old she is. And again, there are debates about when Jane Seymour was born. Elizabeth Norton is writing a new biography of Jane Seymour for Routledge. Maybe she'll shine some new light on that. I don't know. But it's likely that she would have been a maid of honour. if she was young enough for that kind
Right.
of role.
That's the question, right? How old was she? What year was she
Exactly.
born for sure?
Yeah.
And I think I was kind of surprised in your book at the number of women who were in her funeral procession, because I think it was different than what I had previously read, because I think we had always been told it was like 37. And I think in yours you said 49. Does that sound right?
In whose funeral procession?
Jane Seymour's.
Oh, in Jane's.
Yes.
Oh gosh, I looked at the list and counted them up. There are a lot. Like, it's a big funeral. The king was not stinting on the black cloth on that one.
No, no. Well, she gave him that son, right? So
Exactly.
I,
Exactly. And they
I
died before she could annoy him.
right. I think that, that probably would have been the case. We know Henry well enough to know. Uh, but the question has always been, what year was she born? And the same, obviously,
Yeah.
I've been studying Thomas Seymour, and I think they were close in age. And was it 1507? Was it 1508? Was it 1509? Well, then if she served in Catherine's household, she would have been in her 20s and in
Exactly. So
1530.
probably not a maid of honor if that's the case.
Yeah,
She'd be too old for that.
I'd be interested to see what Dr. Norton comes out with
Mm,
in her book. I can't wait to read that one as well. You mentioned Jane, Lady Rochford, who, of course, is probably one of the most well-known of the ladies in waiting. And her story is just so interesting. It's confusing and tragic.
yeah.
When we get to the part with Catherine Howard, it really makes one scratch their head and go,
Yeah.
what on earth was she doing? What's your take on Jane?
I mean, honestly, I continue to say I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good answer, but I think it's because we don't have all of the information. So when I wrote about this, I tried to almost leave it open-ended in a, well, it there could have been a number of things going on. We'll never really know quite not even what was going on in her head, but I wonder whether she accidentally saw or heard or stumbled across something incriminating and was then kind of drawn into what became kind of almost like a conspiracy, without really intending to be, but was in too deep to be able to back out. I think it's really easy to judge people in the past for what we think of as their poor decisions. But newsflash, dead people make bad decisions too. People then could sometimes make the wrong call or do something that, probably wasn't the best choice. But equally, they're in a kind of situation and under pressures that are really difficult for us to imagine.
Right. And Jane and Culpeper, I should say, really, Catherine Howard and Culpeper were in a fight for their life for the most part. And Culpeper was quick to say that Jane was pushing him, or Catherine was quick to say Jane was pushing her to do things. And Jane's like, I don't really even know if anything happened. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything.
It's not surprising that her mind gave out under that strain. And she, went mad is the phrase that the ambassador uses. But lost her reason. Like, I don't want to put a kind of modern almost diagnosis on whatever happened to her, but she clearly had a kind of massive mental health crisis. I don't know, some sort of dissociation or whatever, but gosh, who wouldn't?
Right.
Under those circumstances.
So Jane, Lady Rochford, joined Catherine of Aragon's household, supposedly probably because of a family connection or rank, and then moved to Anne Boleyn's household because of that connection and continued as such. And when we look at how women joined these households, maybe that's something, not only, family and friends, what other connections would you have to have? Because it really seems like there's this network of women who were all working with each other and figuring out what's going to be the best course of action.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I mean, it's nepotism. It's just that they're honest about that. Absolutely, that's how it works. So you need to know people who are already there, ideally, because you need to know when the next vacancy is coming up, because they're like gold dust. And so often, like, they get promised before anyone's even left. That's particularly, the turnover is very high among the maids of honor because they're the youngest, and so they're the most likely to move on to other things. And sometimes you hear that, you know, when a woman married, she had to leave court. That's an odd urban myth as well. That's not the case. Some women did get married and leave court, but some women got married and kept their place and stayed put. I mean, like Maria de Salinas did. So again, people who are interested in getting their daughters into court are kind of ear to the ground listening, like, okay, well, she's oh no, she's going to stay. Oh, but oh no, that one's already promised. So it's a continual, like, somebody tell me what's going on. But the best way to know is to know the people who are already there. And quite often, if you can't get into the Queen's household, you might try to get into the service of a woman who is in the Queen's service, if that makes sense. So in a countess or a duchess's household, because the real invisible women are the ladies in waiting of ladies in waiting, or the servants of ladies in waiting. They've all got their own female servants, not very many, but some. But those are the ones whose names we hardly ever see. But aristocratic women would have women in their service, and then they could take them into the Queen's privy chamber with them. Because otherwise, if you're not in service at court and you're not on the list, and the guys at the door don't know your face, you're not getting in. And, you know, it's a security measure. So yeah, you need a way in, and that's quite a good way in. And then once the Queen sees you and hears that you're interested, if there's a vacancy, she might bear you in mind if you've sent her enough presents. It's a mission to get a job in the Queen's household.
Well, now, of course, you just opened that door. We have to talk about Anne Bassett.
Yeah.
And you just opened that wide open. I feel like we everybody knows this story. And if you don't, we'll talk about it here a little bit. But we always go back to those darn quail eggs that Jane Seymour was eating.
Not even the quail eggs, it's the quails themselves.
Oh, there we go.
Jane Seymour was pregnant with the future Edward VI, and she had a craving for quails, which are, you know, small birds, and they're a delicacy. And Anne Bassett's mother and stepfather are the Lisle family, Viscount and Viscountess Lisle. And Arthur Viscount Lisle is the deputy of Calais. So he's in charge of Calais, basically. So the family live in Calais, but they don't want to lose touch with the English court because they know it's important to have family members in front of, you know, the Queen and the King, to remind them of the family's interests. So they try really hard to get one of the daughters, Anne, or her sister Catherine, into the Queen's service. They have a London guy, a London agent, who conducts all their business in London when they're not there. His name's John Hussey. They write endless letters back and forth. And he's the one who's got his ear to the ground going, well, so-and-so says there'll be a vacancy here. Send a gift to this person because they might. Oh, and actually you should put one daughter in the Duchess of Suffolk's household. And Lady Lila's like, I don't want her in the Duchess of Suffolk's household. But why? And there's a lot of discussion back and forth about all of this. And eventually the girls are sent over, and they're in the care of, it's Eleanor, Duchess of Rutland, and the Countess of Sussex at the time. The Countess of Sussex is a kind of loose relation of Lady Lisle. So again, it's family connections. Okay. And those countesses, I mean, they take their roles seriously. They start ripping apart the girls' wardrobes and lending them clothes and making them fashionable. And they take them into the Queen's chamber. And Jane Seymour chooses Anne Bassett, who's actually the younger sister. But she's also seems to have been, she's said to have been the prettier one. And she just seems to have had that particular kind of sparkle. She's more ambitious, I think, than Catherine. Catherine, the older sister, seems to be, from what we can gather, kind of quieter and gentler and, you know, probably nicer to be around, but not such a courtier. So I think the right girl got the job on that occasion. You know, you want to be a courtier, go ahead, because yeah.
I don't want that.
So yes, Anne Bassett joins the Queen's household as a maid of honor. She's sworn in. They say you'll have £10 a year, which is a classic maid of honor salary. Initially, they say wear out your clothes from France first, and then the Queen changes her mind and says, no, you need new clothes that are not French style. Okay, fine. And this is where the rumor, I think, about the gable hoods and the French hoods comes from. Lots of people say, you know, Jane Seymour refused to let anybody wear French hoods because Anne Boleyn had worn French hoods and she wore the gable hood. And the Lisle letters do say that Anne Bassett is given a gable hood instead of a French hood, but there's nothing to say that that's a universal rule. And surviving wardrobe accounts do show that Jane Seymour had and wore French hoods as well. So yeah, it's not quite as marked as we think.
I feel oh, go ahead.
So I was just going to say Anne Bassett only really was in position for not very long at all, a few weeks before Jane Seymour goes into labour. And then dies tragically. So Anne no sooner gets the job than she's out of a job.
Right. Poor Anne and poor Lady Lisle, who works so hard to get her daughter. Yeah. And I think about the clothing and all of the changes, how expensive it must have been for them to do these wardrobe changes, especially when it was unexpected and if you didn't have the income for it.
Yeah. It is expensive. I don't think I ever totted it up. And I always find it, I'm not very kind of numbers minded or economically minded. So I find it difficult to, you know, see a sum of Tudor money and go, whoa, well, that's loads, or kind of make that relevant or understand really how much that is. The National Archives currency converter is great because it'll tell you how many days or how many years of a skilled tradesman's wages, you know, that's worth, or how many horses you could buy for this amount of money. But it is like large sums of money for any kind of ordinary person, and not a small amount even for an aristocratic family to outfit somebody.
Right.
Yeah, but I think they're hoping that they do it. It's a kind of almost a one-off expense to get these things, and then it's just kind of ongoing upkeep. But of course, Anne Bassett is 16. You're not necessarily done growing when you're 16, are you? So there are various letters going, you've sent me hose, they're too small. I've grown. I need more. I've grown out of this. So yeah.
Yeah. And then after Jane Seymour dies, there's like this period of time where there is no queen before Henry marries Anne of Cleves. And correct me if I'm wrong, that's the period where there's no place for Anne Bassett to go until they decide to place her somewhere. Where did they put her again?
So there's two periods where Anne Bassett is essentially homeless, and she's sent around to various friends and relatives. So I think in this gap, she spends some time with Jane Ashley, Lady Mutus, who is another lady in waiting, and also with Lady Denny for a while. And I think between the Dennies and the Lisles, there might be a vague kinship connection.
Okay.
But yeah, she does get farmed out, and the king says, well, I'll pay for this. But what the king says and what the king does are sometimes two different things. So there are letters going, well, he said this, but we haven't seen any money yet.
Weird how that works.
So I think initially she goes home with the Countess of Sussex, and then Lady Lisle writes to the Countess of Sussex like, well, I'm so sorry to have put you to extra charge. That was never my intention. And it does suggest the Countess of Sussex had written to her going, well, am I supposed to pay for that? You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's awkward. They don't want to send Anne home because everybody thinks it won't be very long until there's a new queen. So there's no point in her making the journey if there'll be a new queen really soon. But it turns out that it is a wee while.
A little bit. Yeah. I love there's a little anecdote that you included about, I don't remember whose household she was in, where she was a little too big for her britches and had to be put in her place.
Yeah, because the letters are one-sided and they don't tell the full story, it's really tantalizing. But definitely there's some quarrel, and Anne annoyed the Countess of Sussex. And was roundly scolded, I think, by everybody. And John Hussey writes to Lady Lisle, like, it's all fine now. The Countess of Sussex has forgiven her and she's behaving better. But it's kind of, although she's forgiven her, she will not forget it. Okay.
Yeah. Forgive, but never forget.
Yeah.
Right? One of the other things that kind of made a little impact on me that I hadn't considered, and I'm kind of going back to the beginning of the book now, is the ladies in waiting of Catherine of Aragon and how many were pregnant at the same time and left court at the same time. I think we forget that these women also had lives other than being just ladies in waiting. correct me if I'm wrong. Were there 3 women at once who were gone?
Well, possibly. Yeah, we don't always know exactly when in a given year a birth or a pregnancy happened, but we know that Bessie Blount, Maria de Salinas, and Elizabeth Stafford, Countess of Surrey, all gave birth to babies in 1519. So it's quite likely that they were, for at least some of the time, they were all gone.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is something that I wanted to make sure to talk about in the book, was their lives outside of the royal court, because although they were ladies in waiting, that was not their entire existence. Most of them who are married noblewomen also have husbands and families and estates to run and other responsibilities, and they are not at court 24/7 all of the time. So yeah, and when ladies in waiting get pregnant, much like the Queen, when they get near their time, they withdraw into confinement and they go home to do that and to give birth. And depending how well it goes, I think depends how quickly they're back.
Yeah.
They do come back within a few months, I would have thought, mostly, but yeah.
And it's possible some of them did not come back?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, pregnancy is a risky business, so is childbirth. Yeah, or it might be that a woman kept her position at court, but once she was pregnant and once she was having children, she, wasn't going to be a lady in waiting anymore, or didn't choose to be, or for whatever reason. It might depend as well how far her husband's estates were from court. So you don't see, for instance, many women of the Percy family at court or being ladies in waiting, but that's probably because the Percys are Dukes of Northumberland, and it's a really long way.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Pepsid Complete knows that food is one of the best parts of game day. That is, until heartburn strikes. Thankfully, just one chewable tablet of Pepsid Complete provides dual-action heartburn relief with an antacid that starts working instantly and an acid reducer that lasts all day. So you can stay focused on that second helping of chili without worrying about heartburn. All day based on 8-hour symptom relief studies during the day. Use product only as directed.
So let's say we have Maria is gone, Bessie is gone, and Elizabeth. They're all gone at the same time. Does anybody fill their role at court, or does it just stay vacant?
Somebody would probably fill in. So the core of the ladies in waiting, the Queen's household, would be considered the household in ordinary, which means every day. But if for any reason someone is absent, usually for pregnancy-related reasons, someone else would step in and she'd be a lady in waiting extraordinary, which I just enjoy as a term. But it just means, she's not there every day all the time. She doesn't necessarily always hold a defined position. So sometimes that's people filling in. Or it might just be peeresses who've popped in while they're in town or something like that, but don't hold a regular daily position.
Yeah. This is such a fun topic. And I know I say this with almost every episode, but I feel like we could talk about this for 3 hours because there is so much to cover when it comes to it. I am curious, and I think I asked you this last time you were on the show too. Was there any piece of research that you came upon that surprised you that maybe you hadn't heard about before?
Oh yeah, Maria's letters. Yeah, I didn't expect to uncover much more about her than we already had. So when I could figure out exactly who her family were and what they were doing, but then found letters she wrote in her own hand, and you can really access her own voice. Yeah, that was the best bit. I
love that. And were her letters written in Spanish?
Yes.
Yes. And I love that you were able to read those and understand them.
I had help.
That's okay
if
too.
you saw them on the page, you'd know what I mean. It's very, if it was that handwriting in English, I could probably have managed.
Right.
If they were printed, but in Spanish, I could have managed. But the two combined, no, I had help. This was quite collaborative research.
Yeah, that is interesting. When you look at paleography, it is much easier when you're reading your own language.
Oh, yeah.
Even with the non-standardized spelling, you can still
Yeah.
figure out each letter. But when you have a foreign language that comes into it, you can't just make assumptions and go, I believe this is what they were trying to say, or I believe that's what this letter is, because you just don't know.
Exactly. And handwriting at the same time is not the same in different countries.
Yeah.
So, what is a kind of hand in 1505 in England is not the same as it would be in Spain. Yeah, fun times. And Spanish was not a language I learned at school. I learned French and German. But I have now learned quite a fair bit of Spanish off the back of it.
Well, that helps with your research to at least even have
definitely.
just that little inkling of so many languages gives you a heads up in definitely a lot of areas. Well, Dr. Nikki Clark, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking to us about these ladies in waiting. It's been a joy having you.
Thanks for having me.
And if you're listening, please be sure to put Nikki's book on your wish list. Order it from the UK. I'll have some links in the show notes as well.
Blackwell's does free shipping, I believe.
Oh, perfect. I will definitely add that link for you. Nikki, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you.